Hello, hello, hello. Um, yeah. So the first things first. Like, I don't want to speak too loud because I'm in a ward in London, in a hospital ward. So the first thing to say, obviously, is I'm really, really sorry for the second occasion. I think I haven't managed to get to Cornwall to speak, um, but I will do one day fairly soon, hopefully, because I love Cornwall and yeah, I do want to get down there. Obviously, as I think you all know, I'm in hospital at the moment, and so needless to say, I haven't been able to get down there. I am hoping to be out, having said that, in the next day or two. Been here for 2 weeks now, so and I am on the mend, so all being well, everything should be okay. Um, so yeah, obviously, thank you so much for inviting me to speak. And I sort of feel like I've semi been flown in, so I'm not quite sure what the previous speaker said. So apologies if I'm going to repeat one or two things, but I probably am not because I'm going to talk about a few general things really. Um, and my understanding is that there's been quite a lot of discussion, obviously, around the obscenity of the refugee crisis and the very clear connection between that crisis and the climate crisis. And I'd like to say before starting, I think everyone here tonight understands this ever increasing coincidence between social injustice and the climate crisis and the democratic crisis. All these things are really, not in a rhetorical sense, but in a real sense, um, part of the same situation now. Um, yeah. I might have one or two little interruptions just to give it a sort of casual feel. So the nurses just come in. Anyway, right. So where am I up to? Um, all right. So as you probably know, I've done about 100 public talks, probably 200 actually. I can't quite remember. And um, if you've been to one of my talks, you know that I tend to talk about the horrors of the climate crisis. And I will start with one or two central facts about where we're up to with the refugee crisis and what have you, and then take it from there. And in the main talk I've been doing for the last year, I I mentioned this paper, which many of you may know, The Future of the Human Niche, which predicts 100 million refugees at 2 degrees centigrade, which, depending on who you speak to, is coming along some point in the late 2030s, in 15, maybe 20 years from now, which is no time at all, of course. And I also sometimes mention the UN report, which came out during the beginning of the Ukraine conflict, which sort of got buried, which said there will be up to 700 million refugees just in Africa by 2030. And that always reminds me of what Tom Tuggenhart said. So I don't know if you know Tom Tuggenhart. I think that's how you pronounce his surname. He's a Tory MP and he's studying for Prime Minister. So he said to Open Gathering a little while ago that people in the UN had told him that if you think Syria is a terrible thing, wait until, quote, there's 500 million refugees from the Sahel, from Central Africa, having to move. And the important thing to understand about these numbers is this is no speculation. It's not a could be, maybe situation. This is hard predictions in 2023. Hundreds of millions of people, through no fault of their own, are going to be subject to suffering and injustice beyond the imagination. And over the last 2 or 3 years of speaking to the public, I've sort of begun to understand that when you tell facts to people like this, it creates a certain confusion and alienation. And the reason for this, I've come to understand, is because we interpret facts through stories that have been told to us. And if we're given facts which don't fit into those stories that have been told to us, then we tend to get annoyed, ignore them, go into denial and what have you. And of course, the stories we've been told are not compatible with these realities, because these stories say, the world's got a few problems, but it can be sorted out. The elites aren't that great, but they're not a murderous sort of bunch of psychopaths. Things are broadly okay. There's issues, and we're trundling along. All these stories that many of us have been told, and they're not the stories we need to tell ourselves, because they're not true. And what I want to do is to try and introduce to you some new stories. I think you might say they're older stories of the human experience. And by stories, I don't mean stories in a shallow sense. I mean, in a very deep sense, the sort of narratives which enable us to make sense of the world around us and how that world and gives us a sense of place and purpose. So what I'm going to do, if you don't mind, is this is a little bit of an experiment. I'm going to go through 3 new stories. And as I said, they're not new in any real sense, because people have been telling these stories for thousands of years. And I'm sure many of you are sort of familiar with them, but I don't think there's any harm to remind ourselves of these older stories. And maybe some of you will be hearing them for the first time. But I think it's a pathway to a far greater sense of self-purpose and resilience. And I'm sure we all agree at this time of enormous social confusion, we all need something to hold on to, which is solid and gives us some sense of solidity. So I am, by the way, going to talk about practicalities, dare I say it. So this isn't just some, general chat. As you know, I'm a practical guy. So we will be talking about pathways and such like at the end, and I'm sure you'll be open to that. But let's just look at these 3 stories. And there's many ways of talking about these things. So I apologize by putting it into a sort of personal frame, but sometimes that's helpful. So when in November, I did a 20-minute speech to online, a bit like this one, dare I say it, to Just Stop Oil activists and various other people. And, I spoke about the climate crisis. I spoke about why civil resistance is vital at this time. And I argued that people could and should take part in blocking of the motorways and the gantries, which happened last November. And as you may know, in that Zoom call, there was a Sun journalist, and they recorded the call, gave it to the police. The police arrested me, and I've been arrested by the police many times, and usually I'm let out after a day because there's no evidence. But in this situation, partially because of the changes in legislation, I was charged with a conspiracy to cause a public nuisance on the basis of this freestanding speech. And I ended up being in prison for 4 months over the winter and Christmas. along with around 50 or 60 other people who, many of whom had similar sentences, which is probably the biggest jailing of activists in Britain since the suffragettes. And I suppose the old story, or the default story we tell ourselves about this is terrible, it should never happen. Putting people into prison is really bad. The government should behave itself. It should be decent, and all the rest of it. But I'd like to suggest another story, and the other story is, well, obviously this is what people do who are engaged in the systematic extermination of thousands of people, thousands of cultures and traditions around the global south. If these people are prepared to destroy the way of life of billions of these innocent people, it should really come as no surprise that when they're substantially challenged to stop their terrible behavior, they will turn upon us with a similar level of viciousness and oppression. In other words, we should not be surprised that the British ruling class is reacting with repression towards activists and campaigners at this point, because we are exposing their violence and their horrendous behavior. And this is what elites have done. This is what elites always do. And in no way do I want to justify it, of course. The point is it is to be expected. It's to be expected. What's not to be expected is that we go and ask them to change and they change. They're not going to change because they're making too much money and they're too full of their own pride and they're absorbed in a psychopathic ideology. So of course they're going to arrest me for doing a 20-minute speech. Of course they're going to put my friend David in prison for 10 weeks for saying climate change in court. Of course they're going to arrest Trudy, who put a sign saying you have a constitutional right to go against the judge outside where the jury went into a courtroom. This is what social change means in the 2020s. This is what social change has always meant in this country. How do you think we got our rights in the first place? By asking nicely? No. We did them through confrontation, and that confrontation provoked repression. And through that repression, we built our movements of resistance, and they won, not despite the repression, but because the repression created the solidarity, which is probably one of the reasons you're in this room tonight. So the second story I want to sort of tell is about my experience in prison. I mean, I've been to prison quite a few times as it happens. And there's many different people with many different stories about prison. But I want to share a common story, which is I was talking to a prisoner and, they always ask you, well, Roger, what are you in for? And I have to confess, I was quite a little bit full of a certain pride when I said, well, I might be in for 6 months making a speech, being a little bit self-pitying and what have you. And he said to me words to the effect, oh, I've been in for 20 years, but you know what? I'm going to be out in 2 years, and that's no time at all. 2 years is no time at all. And you can imagine I felt slightly put in my place, which happens in prison all the time. You go in with a slightly cocky attitude, and within about a week, you realize, there's so many terrible things happening, far worse than have ever happened to you. And the story, of course, is everything depends upon perspective. You know, we may think it's terrible Roger Hallam has gone to prison for 4 months, but it's all about perspective and what you bring to the life that you're living. And this guy was resilient enough to go, I don't care that I'm in prison for the next 2 years because I'll be out soon. And he had this amazing positive resilience, which is so inspirational, and I hope, you know, speaks to you. And incidentally, I had a very good conversation with Marcus, who some of you may know, who's just been sentenced to 3 years for putting a banner across one of the main bridges in London. And you might imagine, you know, I think this was a day or two after his sentence, and you may imagine that we wanted to pursue the story of how terrible this was and how annoyed we are with the establishment and how unjust it was. But to be honest with you, we didn't pursue that story. The story we talked about was the calmness which comes from being in prison and making sure that the time you spend in prison is time well spent. In other words, we both accepted that this is the way life is now for both of us, that we will be put into prison potentially again and again, and this will happen to many other people. And he said to me, you know, his motivation is to speak the truth and to act as if it is real, which you remember was one of the founding slogans of Extinction Rebellion. And if you act as if it's real, then it's no surprise that the British establishment is going to lock you up, and so be it. So the third story is a little bit more personal and embarrassing, which is a fortnight ago, I fell off my bike. So I've been cycling for all my life. I haven't fallen off my bike for 40 years, and I have a certain self-image that I'm not the sort of guy that falls off his bike. But there was a 1 in a million chance of my front wheel going over certain bumps on a London road. And within a split second, I was on the ground, having broken my leg in 4 places. And there's something enormously humiliating if you are embedded in the story that life owes you things and you have a certain entitlement and you're a good person and bad things shouldn't happen to you, and you have a very important meeting to go to, and why the hell has fate delivered this blow to you? And obviously it's a wake-up call to another story, and this other story, of course, is that the fact of the matter is that this life we all live doesn't owe us anything, and anything can happen to any of us at any time for no particular reason. And that's, brutally speaking, the way things are, as if we're honest with ourselves. But the other story is that despite the absurdity of life and this arbitrariness and this horrendous injustice that we have to suffer and experience, we have the agency to create something beautiful out of our imagination and decide it is worth living our life, and it is worth being compassionate and standing up for justice and living a life of ethical purpose. And without wishing to get over philosophical about it, there's a guy called Albert Camus, who some of you may know, who was a major writer in the 20th century and fought in the French resistance. And he experienced this sense of absurdity, of course, all the time, because in the French resistance, you never knew whether you were going to be alive tomorrow and what have you. But he wrote very elegantly, I think, around this notion that we can't rely upon some big, system to support us, some philosophical system. All we can decide to do is to live for the common good. and to do our best, regardless of what life throws at us. And again, this provides us with the resilience I would like to suggest that we need to connect with at this time, because we're moving into a world where the old stories don't work for us anymore. And these new stories are going to be the stories that enable us to maintain our dignity and our commitment and our good works in the years to come, when we all know, at least on a material level, things are going to get a lot worse. But the great paradox, of course, is that they can, and no doubt will, give us a sense of community and purpose, which carries us through, and maybe even gives us a greater sense of ourselves than we had during the so-called good times, when all we needed to think about was ourselves. So I think listening to those stories, it's quite easy to go, oh, yes, of course, they're a good idea. But sometimes it takes life experiences to really understand them on a visceral level. And maybe some of you will never sort of want to adopt them, and some of you may be great at adopting them. And it's one of life's mysteries, I think, about how people do grow into greater resilience. But I think it is useful at least to engage with them. And maybe you don't think much of them tonight, but maybe in 2 years' time, when you've been unjustly thrown into a Cornwall prison cell, you might just remember them and it might help, who knows. So I want to return to that sort of practical task at hand, which is the purpose of all these stories and this resilience is, of course, to fulfill our compassionate duty to resist what we see happening all around us at this time. And the refugee crisis is an obscenity which is only going to expand for the reasons we know. And we also know that the core, a central causal factor in the refugee crisis is the digging up of fossil fuels. It's the fossil fuels that create the weather chaos, which creates the migration, which creates the refugees. And we have an enormous responsibility in the Western world to enter into resistance at this time, because it's our governments that are creating this hell for millions of innocent people. So it shouldn't come as any surprise, I suppose, that thousands of people have engaged in civil disobedience over the past year or so, with the biggest climate campaign in the UK, arguably, Just Stop Oil. I think nearly 2,000 people have been arrested, 150 people being put into prison. Nothing like this has really happened since the suffragettes. And I think the reason people are stepping forward is because they sense in 2023, we no longer have a choice. This old paradigm of consumer activism, which was prevalent in the neoliberal period of, I have my life, and on Saturdays I go and deliver a few leaflets, and I might go on a demonstration once a year. There's a general sense, is there not, that the enormity of what we face leaves us with no other choice if we wish to pursue the common good, but to act in resistance. So concretely, what Just Stop Oil and various other groups are doing is working with our sister movements in other countries and doing slow marches and blocks of roads and such like, which has given given the oil and gas crisis, a massive amount of publicity. I think 90% of people in the UK are now familiar with the arguments of just stop oil. And we are now in the process of a new 12-week campaign, which may well continue for another 12 weeks into the autumn. And thousands of people, I think 3,000 people, have now signed up to go on a slow march, which, dare I say, is still legal. Though obviously nothing in this country is entirely legal anymore, but fundamentally the chances of arrest are low. And so I'd like to invite you all to sign up tonight to come up to London along with hundreds of other people from the Southwest. I'm not sure of the dates, and participate in a few days of these marches, which increasingly will be on the front pages of the papers in a way that we know how all that works. So I do want to do a little bit of audience participation, dare I say it. So hopefully this is all right with Matt, and hopefully it's going to work. But I'd like you to put your hand up. Put your hand up if you are considering coming to London for at least a day or so to engage in a slow march. Could you put your hand up if you know about this and you think you might do it? Okay, cool. So what I'd like to do is just to spend a few minutes, talk to the person next to you, and they may be someone who's also going up, in which case you can tell each other what your motivation is to go up to London. If it's someone who hasn't decided to go up to London, you can tell them about it and encourage them to join you and to bring their friends, of course. And if it's two of you who haven't yet decided, maybe you can discuss what you need to do in order to make that commitment, assuming that's a possibility for you. So let's just take 3 or 4 minutes out just to talk about this practical act of solidarity.